The relentless Chicago rain had transformed the world outside St. Jude's Rectory into a blurring watercolor of slate and charcoal, a weeping landscape that hadn't known a dry hour in 3 days. Inside the third-floor bedroom, Father Thomas Thorne stood with his forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the water cascade from the rusted gutters in sheets that looked like heavy gray curtains. The condensation from his breath fogged the pane, obscuring the view of the cracked asphalt parking lot below, but he didn't wipe it away. He didn't need to see the potholes to know they were filling with oily sludge, just as he didn't need to see the water stains spreading across the sanctuary ceiling to know the roof was failing. The building was dying, groaning under the weight of 80 years of neglect and the harsh Midwestern elements, breathing its last in damp, wheezing gasps that echoed through the heating vents. Thomas turned away from the window, the movement sharp and precise, a remnant of a life he had supposedly left behind. At 34, he wore the black cassock with a rigid discipline. But the man beneath the cloth was still Thomas J. Thorne, the senior forensic auditor who had once terrified CFOs from Manhattan to Zurich. He caught his reflection in the small, chipped mirror above the dresser, the hollowed cheeks, the eyes that were too alert, too predatory for a man of God. The collar around his neck felt less like a symbol of servitude and more like a leash he had placed on himself to keep the wolf at bay. But on days like this, when the atmospheric pressure dropped and the city smelled of wet concrete and ozone, the wolf paced. He adjusted his cuffs, checking the time on a watch that was far too expensive for a parish priest. A vintage Omega, a parting gift from his firm when he announced he was trading his 6-figure salary for a vow of poverty. It was 4:15 p.m. The soup kitchen in the basement would be in full swing. He needed to be down there, offering grace, not up here brooding over the structural integrity of the masonry. The descent was a journey through the stratification of the church's decay. The third floor smelled of old paper and dust. The second, where the empty guest rooms lay, smelled of mothballs. The ground floor sanctuary smelled of beeswax and stale incense. But as Thomas opened the heavy oak door to the basement stairs, the air changed instantly. It became thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of boiled onions, wet wool, and the distinct, metallic tang of too many bodies in a confined space. It was the smell of survival. Thomas moved down the stairs, his footsteps swallowed by the din of the crowd below. The basement hall was a cavernous space painted a cheerless institutional yellow, illuminated by fluorescent tubes that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. It was packed. The rain had driven everyone inside. The regulars who lived under the I-90 overpass, the families living out of their sedans, the silent men who stared at their shoes and spoke to no one. He moved through the tables, his hand resting briefly on shoulders, offering quiet greetings. He played the part and he meant it, but his eyes, those auditors' eyes, were recording data. He saw the water dripping into a plastic bucket near the north wall. He noted the flickering exit sign. He calculated the BTU loss from the drafty windows. The church was hemorrhaging money it didn't have on utilities because the insulation was non-existent. He reached the serving line, the heat from the kitchen radiating outward. Mrs. Maria, the parish's head cook and unofficial matriarch, was stationed behind the large stainless steel counter. Usually, Maria was a force of nature, a woman who wielded a ladle like a scepter and dispensed tough love along with the bread rolls. Today she looked small. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes red-rimmed, and she was moving with a frantic, jerky energy that set off alarm bells in Thomas's head. She didn't look up as she wiped a tray with a rag that had seen better days, mumbling about the bread running low. Thomas stepped up beside her, looking at the line that still stretched out the door and up the stairs. It was a heavy turnout due to the weather, but something else was wrong. He watched the way her hand hesitated on the handle of the ladle. He looked down into the pot. The liquid was pale. It wasn't the rich, golden broth that Maria prided herself on, shimmering with fat and packed with vegetables. It was translucent, a ghostly beige suspension where a few lonely carrots bobbed like shipwreck survivors. It looked like dishwater. When Thomas asked her what it was, Maria flinched. She ladled a serving into a bowl, mostly broth, hardly any substance, and handed it over with a trembling hand. When the man moved away, she turned to Thomas. and he saw the shame burning in her face. She confessed in a hiss that she had to add 5 gallons of water, or they would have run out an hour ago. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had signed the purchase order for the Cisco delivery himself on Monday. 80 pounds of chicken legs, 50 pounds of potatoes. When he asked where the food was, Maria looked around the kitchen as if checking for spies, pulling Thomas back toward the pantry. She told him the truck didn't come because there was a stop on the account. Credit hold. Robert Sterling, the chairman of the Finance Council, had come down yesterday morning and told her the accounts were frozen until the next quarterly distribution. He had told her the poor should be grateful for whatever they get. The name landed between them like a physical blow. Robert Sterling, the man who sat in the front pew every Sunday, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his suit tailored, singing hymns with a voice that oozed piety. The man who had, just 2 weeks ago, stood on a podium at the parish gala and accepted a giant novelty check for $200,000 on behalf of the St. Jude's Restoration Fund. He had told her to water down the soup because the roof repairs were eating everything. Thomas told Maria she did the right thing by feeding them, but his voice was flat, devoid of inflection. He wasn't talking about the soup anymore. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, bypassing the tables, ignoring the blessings. He walked straight through the crowd, up the stairs, his cassock swirling around his ankles. The anger that rose in him wasn't hot. It was ice cold. It was the clinical, detached fury of a man who sees a crime scene and knows exactly where the weapon is buried. He bypassed his bedroom and went straight to the parish office on the 2nd floor. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the rain-streaked window at the end. He unlocked the heavy frosted glass door and stepped inside. The office was a relic of the 1970s, wood paneling, green carpet, and a smell of stale coffee and old toner. Thomas didn't turn on the overhead lights. The gray daylight filtering through the blinds was enough. He locked the door behind him and flipped the deadbolt. He moved to the desk, a massive mahogany fortress that belonged to a time when priests were princes of their little domains. He sat down, the leather chair creaking. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. When he opened them, Father Thomas was gone. The auditor was in the chair. He reached for the bottom drawer, unlocking it with a small key from his keyring. Inside were the physical binders, the monthly printouts that church law required them to keep, even though Sterling insisted everything was more secure in the cloud. Thomas pulled out the binder labeled FI 2025, St. Jude Parish. He slammed it onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He opened it to September. To a layman, the pages were just columns of numbers, boring and impenetrable. To Thomas, they were a narrative. They were a map. He traced the lines with his finger. Income from weekly collections, $14,000. Income from gala pledges, $215,000. He paused. The gala money was listed as received. It was in the general ledger. So where was it? He flipped to the expenses. Utilities, payroll, maintenance. He saw the entry for roof maintenance paid to Apex Construction for $65,000. He looked up at the ceiling where a brown water stain was currently blooming in the corner of the office. $65,000? For that kind of money, the roof should be plated in gold. Apex Construction had been working on the roof for 6 months. Yet the buckets in the sanctuary multiplied every time it rained. He looked further down the list. Consulting retainer paid to Veritas Services Group, $18,000. Facilities management paid to Veritas Services Group, $12,000. He flipped back to August. Same entries. July, June, May. The entry was rhythmic. $30,000 a month, every month, paid to Veritas Services Group. Thomas sat back. The church's total monthly operating budget was barely $40,000. 75% of their liquidity was flowing out to a single entity. Veritas. Truth. He turned to the computer. It was an ancient desktop that hummed loudly, but it had internet access. He woke the screen and opened a browser. His fingers flew across the keyboard. First, he searched for Apex Construction. The result was a generic landing page with no photos of staff and an address in a strip mall in Cicero. Then he searched for Veritas Services Group. Nothing. No website. No LinkedIn profile. He switched to the Illinois Secretary of State's business entity search. He typed in the name. Result found. Status: active. Incorporation date: March 12, 2020. Registered agent: CSC Lawyers Incorporating Service. Manager: LLC member managed. It was a black box. A shell. But the address for the registered agent. Thomas cross-referenced it. It was the same registered agent address as Apex Construction. "You're not even trying to hide it," Thomas muttered. "You think no one is looking." He needed more. He needed to see the bank transfers. The ledger on the desk was just a record of what should have happened, or what Sterling said happened. The bank records were the reality. He navigated to the First City Bank portal. He knew the login because he was technically a signatory, though Sterling had always insisted on keeping the physical token. But Thomas had memorized the backup security questions during the handover meeting 3 months ago. He typed the user ID and the password he had quietly reset last week. The screen loaded. Account balance: $4,203. Thomas stared at the number. $4,000. A parish that took in $250,000 2 weeks ago had $4,000 in the bank. They were insolvent. One boiler breakdown away from bankruptcy. He clicked on Transaction History and filtered by Outgoing Wire. The screen filled with red text. October 1st. Wire to Veritas Services Group, $30,000. September 1st. Wire to Veritas Services Group, $30,000. He clicked on the transaction details for the October wire. He needed the routing number of the receiving bank. Beneficiary bank: Cayman National Bank. Account name: Veritas Holdings Limited. Thomas exhaled. A long, shaky breath that fogged the air in front of him. Offshore. A local maintenance company doesn't bill to the Cayman Islands. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was laundering. Sterling was siphoning the donations, sending them to a domestic shell, which then wired them to an offshore shell. It was classic. It was elegant. And it was destroying the lives of the people eating watered-down soup in the basement. Thomas printed the screen. The printer whirred and spat out the page. He held it in his hand, the paper warm. This was the smoking gun. But as he held it, a sudden thought struck him. If Sterling was moving this much money, he would have alerts set up. He would know someone was accessing the bank portal from the church IP address outside of scheduled accounting hours. As if on cue, the phone on the desk rang. The shrill ring cut through the silence like a knife. Thomas stared at it. The caller ID glowed in the dim light. R. Sterling Mobile. Thomas didn't answer. He let it ring. Then, a text message pinged on his cell phone in his pocket. "The numbers can be confusing, Father. Don't strain yourself. I'm on my way over. We should talk." Thomas felt the hair on the back of his arms stand up. Sterling knew. He was watching. Thomas looked at the clock. 5:30 p.m. The sun had set, and the storm outside had turned the world into a black void. He was alone in the building, except for the kitchen staff downstairs who were packing up. He shoved the printed page into his cassock pocket. He grabbed the flash drive from his keychain and jammed it into the computer's USB port. He began downloading everything: the PDFs of the statements, the ledger exports, the email correspondence he could find. The download bar crawled. He heard a sound. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of a heavy car engine rumbling in the parking lot below. The distinctive, throaty growl of a G-Wagon. A car door slammed. Then the front door of the rectory opened. The heavy thud echoed up the stairwell. "Father Thomas?" Sterling's voice boomed from the ground floor. It was cheerful, too cheerful. "Are you upstairs?" Thomas watched the progress bar. Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy. Deliberate. Not the walk of a man coming to chat. The walk of a man coming to clean up a mess. "Thomas? I brought some scotch. Thought we could review the quarterly goals." The voice was closer now. Second floor landing. Thomas ripped the drive out. He shut the computer down. He stood up and moved to the door. unlocking it just as the knob turned from the outside. He opened the door. Robert Sterling stood there, filling the frame. He was impeccably dressed in a trench coat that cost more than Thomas's car. He was smiling, but his eyes were dead. They scanned the room, landing on the dark computer screen, then snapping back to Thomas's face. "You look pale, Father," Sterling said, stepping into the room without invitation. He smelled of rain and expensive cologne, a mask over the scent of rot. "Working too hard?" Thomas said he was just checking the email, trying to keep his voice steady. Sterling walked to the window, looking out at the storm, talking about opportunities and how people get confused when they look at things they don't understand. He walked closer to the desk, his eyes dropping to the printer tray. It was empty, but Thomas knew he had forgotten to clear the print history on the screen before shutting down. "I saw you logged into the bank," Sterling said softly, dropping the pretense. "Why?" Thomas told him Maria needed money for food. Sterling stopped a foot away from Thomas. He was a big man, physically imposing, used to intimidation. He reminded Thomas that he handled the money, and Thomas handled the prayers. "The soup is water, Robert," Thomas said, meeting his gaze. "The roof is leaking, and the money is in the Cayman Islands. Is that part of the deal?" Silence. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof. Sterling's face didn't change, but his posture shifted. His shoulders squared. The mask was gone completely now. He acknowledged that Thomas was smart, that he had read his file, knowing he was an auditor. "I'm not the one stealing from God, Robert," Thomas said. Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He claimed he wasn't stealing, but taking a commission for keeping the ship afloat. He stepped closer, invading Thomas's personal space, demanding the printout and the drive. Thomas felt the flash drive burning in his pocket and lied, saying he didn't have anything. Sterling stared at him, then sighed, reaching into his coat pocket. For a second, Thomas thought he was pulling a gun, but he pulled out a phone. He threatened to have the bishop remove Thomas, to ruin him, or they could work together to develop the land and build condos. "Get out," Thomas said. Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Wrong answer." He lunged. It wasn't a clumsy move. Sterling slammed Thomas back against the desk. The lamp wobbled and fell, crashing to the floor. "Give it to me," Sterling snarled, grappling for Thomas's pockets. Thomas shoved him back, adrenaline flooding his system. "It's already sent," he lied. "I emailed it to the archdiocese. It's over." Sterling froze. He stared at Thomas, breathing heavily. The lie hung in the air. Sterling backed away slowly, straightening his coat. He ran a hand through his wet hair. "You think you've won?" Sterling whispered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. It's not just me, priest. It's never just me." He pointed a finger at Thomas. "Watch your back. Accidents happen in old buildings. Stairs break. Fires start." Sterling turned and walked out. Thomas listened to his footsteps fade. He heard the front door slam. He heard the G-Wagon roar to life and peel out of the parking lot. Only then did Thomas sink to the floor, amidst the shattered glass of the lamp. He pulled the flash drive out of his pocket and clutched it tight. He was alive. He had the proof. But as the darkness of the office swallowed him, Father Thomas knew one thing for certain. The audit was over. The war had just begun. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his coat. He couldn't stay here. The rectory was a trap. He needed to disappear into the city, to find a place where the rain and the shadows could hide him until he figured out his next move. He opened the back window, the fire escape slick with rain, and climbed out into the howling night. The metal rungs of the fire escape were slick with moss and rain, biting into the palms of Father Thomas's hands as he descended into the alleyway behind the rectory. The storm was no longer just weather. It was a physical assault, a freezing curtain that lashed against the brickwork and turned the narrow passage into a rushing stream of garbage and dirty water. Thomas's cassock, heavy and sodden, clung to his legs like a shroud, tangling around his ankles with every frantic step. He hit the pavement with a splash that soaked his socks instantly, the cold shock traveling up his shins, grounding him in the terrifying reality of the moment. He didn't look back up at the window he had just climbed out of. He didn't look at the stone cross atop the roof. He simply ran. He sprinted toward the mouth of the alley, his breath tearing at his throat in ragged gasps. The black G-Wagon was still idling in the front lot, its engine a low, predatory rumble that vibrated through the wet asphalt. Thomas kept to the shadows, hugging the graffiti-stained wall of the neighboring tenement building, moving with a desperate stealth that belonged to a man he hadn't been in 5 years. The auditor was awake, adrenaline flooding his system, sharpening his senses until the sound of a distant siren felt like a scream in his ear, and the flash of a neon sign, reflected in a puddle, looked like a police strobe. He wasn't a priest right now. A priest would stay and pray for intervention. An auditor knew that when the numbers didn't add up, the only variable left to remove was the witness. He reached the corner of 43rd Street, the wind whipping his wet hair into his eyes. He paused, pressing himself into the recess of a boarded-up storefront, scanning the street. It was mostly empty, the storm driving the sensible citizens of Chicago indoors, leaving the streets to the desperate and the dangerous. A lone taxi splashed by, its off-duty light glowing like a rejection. Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold plastic of the USB drive. It was there, the evidence, the smoking gun that proved Robert Sterling wasn't just a thief, but a monster who stole bread from the mouths of the poor to feed offshore accounts. But possessing the truth and surviving it were two very different accounting columns. He needed to get off the grid. Sterling would track his phone. The man had access to the parish accounts, which meant he paid the Verizon bill. He knew the number, the IMEI, the location history. Thomas pulled the device from his pocket. The screen glowed with a new notification. Another text from Sterling. Faith is about forgiveness. Thomas. Come back. The manipulation made Thomas's stomach turn. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the phone onto the concrete and brought his heel down on it, once, twice, 3 times until the glass shattered and the frame bent. He kicked the debris into a storm drain, watching the pieces disappear into the black water. Now he was a ghost. No GPS, no contacts, no way to call for help. He pulled his collar up, fumbling with the clerical tab at his throat. He couldn't walk around Chicago looking like a priest. Not tonight. He unbuttoned the collar, pulling the white plastic tab out and shoving it into his pocket. He unbuttoned the top of the cassock, folding the lapels in to make it look like a long, strange overcoat. It wasn't a perfect disguise, but in the dark and the rain, it might pass for the eccentric fashion of a man down on his luck. He headed east, toward the Red Line station. He needed noise. He needed a crowd. He needed Chinatown. Meanwhile, in the warm, dry silence of the rectory office, Robert Sterling stood over the desk where Thomas had sat only minutes before. The room smelled of ozone and the lingering scent of fear. Sterling picked up the fallen lamp, setting it upright with a fastidious, almost gentle motion. He brushed a shard of glass off the mahogany surface. He wasn't panicking. Panic was for people who didn't have leverage. Sterling had leverage, he had money, and in Chicago, money was a force of physics more powerful than gravity. He walked to the window, watching the rain batter the glass. He pulled his own phone from his pocket, a sleek, encrypted device that never appeared on any parish invoice. He dialed a number from memory. It rang once. Vargas. A voice answered. It was a voice like grinding gravel, devoid of warmth or curiosity. "We have a breach," Sterling said, his tone conversational, as if reporting a leaky faucet. "The new administrator. He's impulsive. He has data." Nature of the data? Financials. The Cayman routing numbers. The shell structure. There was a pause on the other end, filled only by the static of the connection. "That is unfortunate, Mr. Sterling. The client will be displeased if that structure is exposed. It took us 3 years to build that labyrinth." "He won't expose it," Sterling said, turning away from the window to look at the empty chair. "He's a priest. He has a conscience. He'll try to go to the authorities or the bishop. He thinks he's a hero in a moral play. He doesn't realize he's in a horror movie." Location. He fled the rectory on foot about 10 minutes ago. I'm tracking his cell, but the signal just died on 43rd. He destroyed it. Smart for a holy man. He used to be a forensic auditor, Sterling said, a trace of bitterness in his voice. He knows how to look, but he doesn't know how to fight. I need you to contain this, Vargas. I don't care about the method. Just retrieve the drive and ensure Father Thomas takes a sudden, permanent sabbatical. Consider it done. My rate has doubled for the weather. Just find him. Sterling hung up. He looked around the office one last time, making sure nothing of his own was left behind. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the dark window. God help you, Thomas, he whispered, a smirk touching his lips. Because I certainly won't. The red line train rattled and screeched its way south, a metal tube of fluorescent purgatory cutting through the night. Thomas sat in the corner of the last car, dripping water onto the linoleum floor. The car was half empty. A few exhausted nurses coming off shift, a man sleeping with a newspaper over his face, a group of teenagers laughing too loudly at a video on a phone. No one looked at Thomas. In this city, a soaking wet man staring at nothing was just part of the scenery. The rhythmic clack-clack of the tracks soothed his racing heart, allowing his mind to shift from flight mode to analysis. He had the what, the theft. He had the who, Sterling. But he didn't understand the why. Sterling was wealthy. His real estate portfolio was public knowledge. Why risk federal prison for a few $1,000,000 from a charity fund? It didn't track. The risk-to-reward ratio was skewed. Unless the money wasn't just for Sterling. Unless the church wasn't just a piggy bank, but a washing machine. Laundering, Thomas thought, watching the lights of the city blur past. You don't just steal money, you clean it. You take dirty cash from somewhere else, mix it with the clean donations, run it through a shell company, and it comes out legitimate on the other side. If St. Jude's was a laundromat, then the people putting the dirty clothes in weren't just crooked developers. They were cartels, gangs, the kind of people who didn't send lawyers. They sent butchers. Thomas shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. He needed Sarah. Sarah Chun was the only person from his old life who hadn't hung up on him when he joined the seminary. She was a brilliant, cynical data analyst who had worked with him at the firm, specializing in cybersecurity and gray hat hacking. She had called him an idiot for throwing his career away to wear a dress and speak Latin. But she had sent him a Christmas card every year. She operated out of a gaming cafe in Chinatown, a place where the internet was fast, the servers were secure, and questions were rarely asked. The train screeched into the Cermak Chinatown station. Thomas stood up, his legs stiff. He stepped out onto the platform, the humid air hitting him. The rain here was tinted red by the massive neon lanterns that strung across the streets below. He descended the stairs, merging into the crowd. Even in the storm, Chinatown was alive. Restaurants were steaming, windows fogged up with the heat of woks and humanity. Thomas navigated the labyrinth of side streets, ducking under awnings. He turned into an alley behind a dim-sum palace, stopping in front of a steel door marked only by a faded sticker of a pixelated dragon. He banged on the metal. A sliding peephole opened. A pair of suspicious eyes peered out. "We're full," a voice grunted. "Tell Sarah that Thorne is here," Thomas shouted over the rain. "Tell her the auditor has a balance sheet that won't balance." The eyes narrowed, then the peephole slammed shut. A moment later, the sound of heavy locks disengaging echoed, and the door swung open. A wall of warm air, smelling of ozone, energy drinks, and vape smoke, hit him. He stepped inside. The Netherworld Cafe was a subterranean bunker of technology. Rows of high-end gaming rigs were occupied by teenagers and 20-somethings, their faces illuminated by the blue and green glow of monitors. The sound was a cacophony of mechanical keyboard clicks, shouted commands in 3 different languages, and the thumping bass of electronic music. Thomas walked to the back, past the rows of gamers who were too engrossed in virtual wars to notice the real one walking past them. In a glass-walled office at the rear, sitting amidst a fortress of monitors and server racks, was Sarah. She looked exactly as he remembered. Sharp features, jet black hair cut in an aggressive bob, wearing a hoodie that read, "I see dead pixels." She was typing furiously, a cigarette burning in an ashtray next to a can of Red Bull. She didn't look up when he entered. "You look like a drowned rat, father," she said, her eyes glued to the scrolling code on her screen. "I thought you weren't allowed to be out past curfew. Doesn't the bell ring for Compline or whatever?" "I need help, Sarah," Thomas said, closing the door to shut out the noise of the cafe. He leaned against the glass, leaving a wet smear. Sarah spun her chair around. Her expression was guarded, her dark eyes scanning him from his wet hair to his ruined shoes. "You don't look like a priest right now, Thomas. You look like you're running." "I am," he admitted. He reached into his pocket and placed the flash drive on her desk, next to the cigarette. "I found something at the parish. I thought it was embezzlement. I think it's worse." Sarah picked up the drive, turning it over in her fingers. "Church scandals. Boring. What is it? Someone dipping into the collection plate for a new Cadillac?" "Try millions," Thomas said, his voice low, "flowing through a shell company in Cicero to the Cayman Islands. And the man running it, he called in a cleaner." Sarah's sarcasm evaporated. She looked at the drive, then back at Thomas. "A cleaner? As in a mop and bucket, or a you're going to have an unfortunate accident type?" "The second one," Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "You always were a drama queen, Thorne. But you never lied about the numbers." She plugged the drive into an isolated laptop, an air-gapped machine she used for analyzing malware. "If this brings heat to my shop, I'm billing the Pope." She began to work. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing scripts, decrypting files. Thomas stood behind her, watching the lines of code cascade like rain. For a moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia for his old life, the safety of the office, the power of the audit. But then he remembered Maria's face, the watered-down soup, and the anger returned. "Okay," Sarah muttered, her brow furrowing. "This is encrypted. AES 256. Standard for corporate finance, but..." She tapped a few keys. "Here we go. The password hint is Midas touch." "Goo." "Sterling's ego," Thomas said. "I'm in." Sarah opened the folder. The spreadsheets filled the screen. She scrolled through them, her eyes widening. "Whoa. Thomas, look at this velocity. The money comes in from anonymous donations, huge chunks, 50 grand, 100 grand, and goes out to Veritas Services within 24 hours. That's not skimming. That's a pass-through." "Laundering," Thomas confirmed. "But look at the source." Sarah pointed to a column of metadata she had extracted. "These donations aren't coming from little old ladies. They're coming from wire transfers originating in Eastern Europe, specifically a bank in Budapest known for handling accounts for the Bratva." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "The Russian mob? Or a syndicate affiliated with them?" Sarah said, her voice hushed. "Veritas isn't just a shell for Sterling. It's a wash cycle for organized crime. Your church is being used to clean drug money or arms money. Sterling is just the local manager, the middleman." "If he's the middleman," Thomas whispered, "then who is he afraid of?" "The people who own the money," Sarah said grimly. "And now you have their ledger." She stopped typing suddenly. Her hand hovered over the mouse. On her secondary monitor, a red warning light blinked. "Thomas," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you access these files from the church computer?" "Yes. I downloaded them." "Did you log out?" "I pulled the plug." Sarah cursed, typing frantically now. "If you pulled the plug while a remote session was active, or if they have a daemon running on the server, they can trace the file signature. As soon as I opened this, it might have pinged back." "Pinged back to where?" "To whoever is watching the digital vault." Sarah spun around, grabbing her backpack from under the desk. "We have to go. Now." "What? Why?" "Because a ghost signal just lit up on my firewall. Someone is scanning for this drive's unique identifier. And the trace is triangulating. They know it's online. They know it's in Chinatown." Thomas looked out through the glass wall of the office. The gamers were still playing, oblivious. But at the front entrance of the cafe, the steel door opened. A man stepped in. He was wearing a dark raincoat, dripping wet. He didn't look like a gamer. He looked like a slab of granite carved into the shape of a human. He stood there, rainwater pooling around his boots, scanning the room with eyes that were cold, dead, and efficient. It was the man Sterling had called. Vargas. "Back door," Sarah hissed, shoving the laptop into her bag and grabbing Thomas's arm. "Move, priest, unless you want to meet your boss early." Thomas stumbled as she pulled him toward a service exit concealed behind a rack of servers. He glanced back one last time. Vargas was moving through the cafe, ignoring the shouting teenagers, walking in a straight line toward the glass office. He moved with the terrifying calmness of a shark entering a school of fish. Sarah kicked the rear door open, and they burst out into the alleyway. The rain was waiting for them harder than before. "Where are we going?" Thomas shouted over the storm. "My car," Sarah yelled back, pulling her hood up. "I know a safe house in Gary. Nobody looks for anything in Indiana." They sprinted down the alley, splashing through puddles that were deep enough to swallow their ankles. Thomas's lungs burned. The weight of the cassock felt like it was dragging him down to the earth. He realized then that the audit was truly over. He wasn't looking at numbers anymore. He was a variable in an equation that ended in zero. As they rounded the corner toward a parked Honda Civic, a gunshot cracked through the air. A sharp, distinct sound that was swallowed almost instantly by a clap of thunder. A brick on the wall next to Thomas's head exploded into dust. "Get down!" Sarah screamed. Thomas dove behind a dumpster, the smell of rotting garbage filling his nose. He looked up. At the end of the alley, silhouetted against the streetlights, Vargas stood, a pistol raised, steady as a statue in the gale. "He's shooting at a priest," Thomas stammered, the absurdity of it hitting him. "He's actually shooting at a priest." "He's not shooting at a priest, Thomas." Sarah grabbed his collar, hauling him toward the car. "He's shooting at a loose end. Get in the car." Thomas scrambled into the passenger seat. Sarah vaulted into the driver's side and slammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Tires squealed on the wet pavement as she threw it into reverse, backing out of the alley just as another shot shattered the side mirror. They spun around onto the main street, merging into traffic, disappearing into the sea of red taillights. Thomas slumped in the seat, gasping for air, clutching the seatbelt. He looked at his hands. They were shaking violently. Sarah glanced at him, her face pale but determined. "Welcome back to the real world, Thomas. I hope you remember how to sin, because praying isn't going to get us out of this." Thomas looked out the back window. The dark shape of Vargas was gone, swallowed by the rain and the night. But he knew the hunter was still there. And now the hunter knew exactly who he was chasing. The Chicago Skyway was a suspended ribbon of asphalt stretching over the black void of the industrial district, a bridge between the frantic energy of the city and the desolate, rust-belt purgatory of northwest Indiana. Sarah drove the Honda Civic with a white-knuckled intensity, the speedometer hovering near 90, her eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror. Beside her, Father Thomas Thorne sat in a silence that was louder than the roaring engine. He was clutching the dashboard, his knuckles white, staring out at the blurred lights of the steel mills that burned like distant, hellish volcanoes against the stormy horizon. The smell of sulfur and wet ash began to seep through the ventilation, replacing the ozone scent of the rain. It was the smell of Gary, Indiana, a city of ghosts, broken glass, and secrets buried under layers of concrete. They exited the highway, the tires humming over the cracked pavement of Broadway. The streetlights here were sparse. Half of them burned out, casting long, skeletal shadows across the boarded-up storefronts and empty lots reclaimed by weeds. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of the Bluebird Motel, a U-shaped structure of peeling stucco and flickering neon that looked like it hadn't seen a guest since the steel boom of the 70s. The no vacancy sign was dark, but the vacancy part buzzed with an erratic, insect-like hum. She killed the engine. The silence that rushed back into the car was sudden and suffocating. "We're here," Sarah said, her voice tight. She didn't look at him. She was watching the entrance of the lot, checking for headlights, for the G-Wagon, for Vargas. "My cousin owns this place. He doesn't ask for ID, and he doesn't have security cameras that record anything other than static. We're off the grid." Thomas nodded slowly, his movements stiff. The adrenaline from the alleyway was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. He looked down at his cassock. It was ruined, mud-splattered, torn at the hem, soaked through to his skin. It felt heavy, like a costume he had worn for a play that had gone horribly wrong. He opened the car door, the wind hitting him instantly, carrying the metallic tang of the nearby refineries. They checked into room 12. It smelled of stale tobacco, bleach, and despair. The carpet was a kaleidoscope of suspicious stains, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, sunburned strips. Sarah immediately began turning the room into a command center. She swept the Gideon Bible and the plastic ice bucket off the wobbly laminate table. Setting up her laptop and a portable signal jammer she fished from her backpack. She moved with a frantic efficiency, a soldier digging a foxhole. Thomas stood by the door, locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. He leaned his forehead against the wood, closing his eyes. He could still hear the gunshot. He could still see the brick exploding inches from his face. In the seminary, they taught him about the spiritual warfare of good versus evil, about the abstract concepts of sin and redemption. They hadn't taught him what it sounded like when a 9mm round broke the sound barrier next to his ear. "Stop praying, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. She was typing furiously, the blue light of the screen illuminating her sharp features. "God isn't encrypted. This file is. Come here." Thomas pushed himself away from the door. He walked to the table, pulling up a chair that groaned under his weight. He watched the screen. Lines of code cascaded like a digital waterfall, the raw data from the St. Jude's server. "I've isolated the transfer protocols," Sarah said, pointing a chipped fingernail at a column of numbers. "You were right about the flow. Donations come in, get washed through Veritas US, move to Veritas Cayman. But here's the kicker. I traced the originating IP addresses for the donors." Thomas leaned in, squinting. "Eastern Europe?" "Worse," Sarah said grimly. "The server hops through a node in St. Petersburg, but the financial origin is a bank in Cyprus known for handling accounts for the Santsevskaya Bratva. The Russian mob," Thomas whispered. The name felt heavy in his mouth, absurd and terrifying all at once. Why would the Russian mob be donating to a crumbling parish on the south side of Chicago? "They're not donating, Thomas. They're paying," Sarah said, hitting the enter key. A new window popped up, displaying a series of invoices attached to the wire transfers. "Look at the memo lines. Medical supplies, educational materials, liturgical artifacts. These are codes." "Codes for what?" Sarah hesitated. She looked at Thomas, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. I cross-referenced the shipping manifests associated with Veritas Logistics, the shell company's transport arm. They have shipping containers moving from the port of Newark to Chicago, then distributing out to the Midwest. The weight discrepancies on the liturgical artifacts don't match statues or pews. They match crates. Specifically, the dimensions of crate type 7N6. "Speak English, Sarah." "Ammunition," she said. "Small arms, assault rifles, modified triggers." "Thomas, your church isn't just a laundromat for dirty cash. It's a distribution hub. They're using the parish's tax-exempt status and the charity shipments to move illegal weapons into the city without customs or ATF scrutiny. Who pulls over a church van driven by a priest?" Thomas felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of the table. He thought of the van. The white Ford Econoline with St. Jude's Outreach painted on the side. He had driven it himself last week to pick up donated blankets. He had signed the manifest. He hadn't checked the boxes. "I drove it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I drove the weapons. I signed for them." "You didn't know," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. It doesn't matter. Thomas stood up, knocking the chair over. He paced the small room, his hands tangling in his wet hair. I facilitated it. Every bullet that kills a kid in Englewood. Every drive-by. I signed the paper. Sterling used me. He used the cloth. He used the altar. He stopped in front of the grimy mirror above the dresser. He looked at himself. The collar was gone, but the black shirt remained. He looked like a shadow. Sterling isn't the boss, Sarah said quietly, turning back to the screen. He's a middleman. He's taking a cut to facilitate the logistics for the Russians. That's why he was so terrified when you found the ledger. If the Bratva finds out their pipeline is compromised, they won't just fire him. They'll liquidate him, and us, 30 miles away, in the penthouse suite of the Onyx Club. A members-only establishment overlooking the Chicago River, Robert Sterling was learning the true definition of fear. The room was opulent, decorated in dark leather and chrome, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the stormy city into a dramatic backdrop. But Sterling wasn't admiring the view. He was sitting on the edge of a velvet sofa, sweating through his $3,000 suit. Across from him, sitting in a high-backed armchair, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of ice. Nikolai Volkov didn't look like a gangster. He wore a bespoke turtleneck and wire-rimmed glasses, sipping sparkling water with a delicate grace. He looked like a university professor or perhaps a surgeon. But the two men standing by the door, Vargas, soaking wet and wiping rain from his pistol, and another behemoth named Yuri, dispelled any academic illusions. It is a simple equation, Robert, Volkov said softly. His English was perfect, accented only by a slight, melodic lilt. We provide the product. You provide the path. In exchange, you become very wealthy. We have had a harmonious relationship for 5 years. It's just a hiccup, Sterling stammered, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. The priest. He's an anomaly. I didn't expect him to be so diligent. But he's gone. He's running. Running with our ledger, Volkov corrected, taking a sip of water. Running with the digital map of our entire Midwest operation. Do you know what happens if that map finds its way to the FBI? Or the ATF? He won't go to the feds, Sterling insisted, his voice rising in panic. He's a priest. He's scared. He'll go to the bishop. The church will try to bury it to avoid scandal. I can handle the church. You assume he acts like a priest, Volkov said. He placed the glass down on the coaster with a precise click. But Vargas tells me he moved like a soldier. He destroyed his phone. He evaded pursuit. This is not a man who is praying for forgiveness, Robert. This is a man who is calculating a strike. Volkov stood up. He walked over to the window, looking out at the rain. You have lost control of your house. When a dog shits on the carpet, you do not blame the dog. You blame the master who failed to train it. Sterling swallowed hard. I'll fix it. Vargas is tracking him. We'll find him tonight. Volkov turned. His eyes were pale blue, void of any empathy. You have 24 hours. If the priest talks or if the data is leaked, the pipeline closes. And if the pipeline closes, I will have to balance my books. And your life, Robert, is the only asset you have left to offer. Volkov nodded to Vargas. Help Mr. Sterling find his stray sheep, and if you find him, do not make it quick. I want to know who else has seen my numbers. Sterling stood up, his legs shaking. He nodded, unable to speak, and hurried out of the room, past the guards, past the luxury, fleeing into the hallway like a man escaping execution. Back at the Bluebird Motel, the rain had intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm on the metal roof. Inside room 12, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a cold, hard resolve. Thomas sat at the table, staring at the screen. Sarah had pulled up a dossier on Sterling, his personal accounts, his real estate holdings, his life. It was a life built on a foundation of lies. The charity galas, the handshakes with the mayor, the photos with the cardinal, it was all a mask for the monster underneath. We have enough to go to the police, Sarah said, though she didn't reach for her phone. We send this anonymously to the FBI. They raid the church. They arrest Sterling. And then what? Thomas asked, his voice low. Sterling gets a lawyer. A good one. He drags it out for years. He claims he was duped by a third party. He throws Maria or the janitor under the bus. Meanwhile, the Bratva closes the Veritas accounts, burns the shell companies, and disappears. The pipeline moves to another parish, another charity. The guns keep flowing. The kids keep dying. He looked at Sarah. His eyes were hard. The softness of the priesthood had been burned away by the acid of the truth. The law is too slow, Thomas said. And the church will try to protect its image first. They'll move me, silence me, maybe even pay Sterling off to go away quietly. I know how the institution works. They fear scandal more than they fear sin. So what are you saying? Sarah asked, leaning back in her chair. You want to go vigilante? You want to buy a gun and go John Wick on them? No, Thomas said. I'm an auditor, Sarah. I don't fight with bullets. I fight with leverage. He pulled the laptop closer. Sterling is greedy. That's his weakness. He's skimming. Look at these side transactions. He pointed to a series of smaller transfers. 20,000 here, 50,000 there. Moving from the Veritas account into a personal holding company called RS Reserve. He's stealing from the thieves? Sarah whispered, a slow grin spreading across her face. The idiot. He's taking a cut on top of his cut. Does Volkov know? I doubt it, Thomas said. The Bratva doesn't tolerate skimming. If Volkov knew Sterling was stealing from the shipment funds, he wouldn't need us to destroy Sterling. He'd do it himself. Thomas sat back, a plan forming in his mind. It was dangerous. It was insane. And it was the only way to end this tonight. We don't give the data to the FBI, Thomas said. Not yet. First, we use it to turn the sharks against each other. You want to frame Sterling? I don't need to frame him. He's guilty. I just need to make sure Volkov sees the specific evidence of the skimming. We need to send the RS Reserve bank statements directly to the Bratva. Sarah stared at him. Thomas, if you do that, they will kill him. You're signing his death warrant. You're a priest. You can't just arrange a hit. Thomas stood up and walked to the window. He peered through the crack in the curtains. He saw the rain. He saw the darkness. He thought of the watered-down soup. He thought of the guns in the church van. He thought of the silence of God in the face of all this noise. I'm not arranging a hit, Thomas said, his voice devoid of emotion. I'm conducting an audit. And when the numbers don't add up, there are penalties. He turned back to Sarah. Can you get Volkov's contact info? Or the secure server the Bratva uses to monitor the accounts? If they're using the Cyprus Bank, they have a secure portal. I can try to inject a message into the admin inbox. It's risky. If they trace it back. Do it, Thomas commanded. But not just that. We need to flush Sterling out. We need him to panic. We need him to run to the church to try and scrub the physical backups before Volkov gets there. How? We empty his accounts, Thomas said. All of them. The RS Reserve. His personal checking. The Cayman shell. You said you have the passwords. Drain them. Send every cent to a real charity. Doctors Without Borders. The Red Cross. Anything. Sarah's eyes went wide. You want to rob the mob and the bagman at the same time? That's beautiful. And suicidal. Sterling checks his accounts every night, Thomas said. I've seen him do it. When he sees the zeros, he'll think the Bratva is seizing his assets. He'll think they know. He'll panic. He'll go to the only place where he has cash hoarded, the wall safe in the rectory office. And then, Thomas said, buttoning his ruined black shirt. I'll be waiting for him. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She saw the change. The man who had walked into the internet cafe looking for salvation was gone. In his place was something colder, sharper. You're going back there? Sarah asked. Vargas will be looking for you. Vargas is looking for a victim, Thomas said. He's looking for a scared priest running for his life. He's not looking for the man who just bankrupted his boss. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the white plastic clerical tab. He looked at it for a second, then tossed it onto the table next to the gunmetal gray of the signal jammer. He wouldn't be wearing it tonight. Tonight, he wasn't Father Thomas. Tonight, he was just Thorne. "Start the transfer," Thomas said. "Burn him down." Sarah cracked her knuckles, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "With pleasure, Father. With absolute pleasure." She hit the keys. The screen blurred with a flurry of progress bars. Transferring funds from RS Reserve. Transferring funds from Veritas Cayman. Transferring funds from Sterling Personal. Total amount, $4,250,000. 00 destination, UNICEF General Fund. Status, processing. Status, complete. In the penthouse of the Onyx Club, Robert Sterling was sitting in the back of his G-Wagon, which was parked at the valet stand. He was trying to calm his shaking hands, waiting for Vargas to get in the driver's seat. He pulled out his phone to check his balance, a nervous tic he had developed over the years. He opened the First Citibank app. He stared. He blinked. He refreshed the page. Balance, $0. He switched to his offshore account app. Balance, $0. A scream rose in his throat, strangling him. He dropped the phone, clattered onto the floor mats. "No," he gasped. "No, no, no. Volkov. It had to be Volkov. The Russian had seized everything. He knew. He must have known about the skimming. Or maybe he just decided Sterling was a liability and cut the cord. If they took the money, the hit was next. Sterling looked out the window. Every shadow looked like an assassin. He needed to run. He needed the emergency cash. The stash in the rectory. 200 grand in unsequential bills, hidden behind the portrait of the Pope. Vargas opened the driver's door and slid in. "We have a lead on a motel in Gary," Vargas grunted. "Forget Gary," Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking. "Drive. Go back to the church. Now." Vargas looked at him in the rearview mirror, eyes narrowing. The Russian said to find the priest. "I said drive." Sterling pulled a snub-nosed revolver from his ankle holster and pressed it against the back of Vargas's seat. It was a desperate, stupid move, but panic had overridden his survival instincts. "Take me to the church, or I swear to God I'll shoot you and drive myself." Vargas stared at him for a second, then shrugged slowly. "You are the boss, Robert." He put the car in gear. As the G-Wagon tore out of the parking lot, heading back toward the south side, Vargas tapped the Bluetooth earpiece in his ear. "He is panicking," Vargas whispered in Russian. "He is heading to the church." "Yes, I will wait for your arrival." Thomas stood in the doorway of room 12, the rain lashing at his face. He watched Sarah finish the encryption on the laptop. "It's done," she said, closing the lid. "Sterling is broke, and I sent the skimming receipts to an email address linked to Volkov's known associates. The Bratva knows Sterling was stealing from them." "Good," Thomas said. "I'm coming with you," Sarah said, standing up and grabbing her keys. "No," Thomas shook his head. "This part won't do alone. You stay here. If I don't call you in 2 hours, send the full file to the FBI. "Thomas, go," he ordered softly. He walked out into the rain, moving toward the Honda Civic. He wasn't going to drive it. He walked past it toward the road. He needed a different car. A car that wouldn't be traced to Sarah. He saw an old pickup truck idling in front of the motel office. The driver, a heavyset man, had hopped out to grab a soda from the vending machine. The engine was running. Thomas walked up to the truck. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't a car thief, but tonight he was whatever he needed to be. He climbed into the cab, shifted into drive, and peeled out of the lot before the owner even dropped his quarter. He drove north, back toward the city, back toward the storm. The skyline of Chicago rose up to meet him, a jagged jaw of broken teeth against the purple sky. He was going back to St. Jude's, back to the sanctuary. But he wasn't going there to pray. He was going there to end it. The wolf wasn't just pacing anymore. The wolf was hunting. The stolen Ford F-150 rattled as it climbed the curb, its suspension groaning under the abuse, and came to a halt in the overgrown shadow of the rectory's detached garage. Father Thomas Thorne killed the engine, plunging the cab into silence, save for the ticking of the cooling metal and the relentless, drumming assault of the rain on the roof. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breath fogging the windshield in shallow, rhythmic bursts. He was back. St. Jude's loomed ahead, a dark monolith against the purple-bruised sky of the Chicago night. The church didn't look like a sanctuary anymore. It looked like a tomb, its stone gargoyles weeping rainwater, its stained-glass eyes dark and hollow. Thomas opened the door and stepped out into the mud. The wind hit him instantly, biting through the thin fabric of his soaked black shirt, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt a strange, vibrating heat in his chest, the kind of hyper-awareness he used to feel right before dropping a subpoena on a corrupt CEO's desk. He wasn't here to pray. He was here to close the account. He moved toward the side entrance of the church, the one used by the choir and the janitorial staff. He didn't need a key. He knew the lock on this door had been broken since 1998. A detail Sterling had repeatedly refused to fund fixing because it wasn't a public-facing aesthetic issue. The irony was bitter on Thomas's tongue as he jiggled the handle and slipped inside. The smell of the church hit him: beeswax, old incense, damp limestone, and the underlying rot of the water damage. It was the smell of his failure and the smell of his home. He moved silently through the sacristy, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The only light came from the lightning flashing outside, casting strobe-like glimpses of the vestments hanging like ghosts in the wardrobe. Thomas didn't stop. He moved to the audio control closet located just behind the altar. It was a cramped space filled with tangles of wires and an ancient soundboard that hummed with a low-frequency buzz. He flicked the power switch on the main amplifier. The green light blinked to life. He didn't turn up the master volume yet. Instead, he pulled a small lapel microphone from the shelf, the one he used for homilies so he could walk among the congregation. He clipped the transmitter to his belt and threaded the mic wire up under his shirt, clipping the small head to his collar. He checked the frequency. Channel 1. He pushed the fader on the board all the way up, but he hit the mute button. One press, and his voice would fill the cavernous sanctuary. One press, and he would be everywhere. He left the closet and walked out onto the altar. The sanctuary was vast and empty, the rows of pews stretching back into the darkness like the ribs of a leviathan. The red vigil lamp flickered near the tabernacle, the only constant star in this man-made night. Thomas walked to the center of the altar, behind the heavy marble table. He crouched down, checking the sight lines. From here, he could see the main doors at the back of the nave, and the side door leading to the rectory office hallway. He waited. Time in the dark is elastic. It stretches and compresses. Thomas counted the seconds by the rhythm of the leaks dripping into the buckets scattered around the perimeter. Drip, drip, splash. He thought about Maria. He thought about the watered-down soup. He thought about the AK-47s, hidden in crates marked Bibles. He let the anger crystallize, turning from a chaotic fire into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. Then he saw the lights. High beams swept across the stained-glass windows on the east wall, illuminating the depictions of the martyrs in a blinding, chaotic wash of color. The roar of an engine cut through the storm, the distinctive, throaty growl of a Mercedes G-Wagon being pushed to its limit. Tires screeched on the wet asphalt outside. A car door slammed with the force of a gunshot. Thomas reached into his pocket and thumbed the mute button on the belt pack, readying the system. The side door to the rectory hallway burst open. Footsteps hammered against the tile floor, heavy, frantic, slipping on the wet residue tracked in from outside. "Where is it? Where is it?" Robert Sterling's voice echoed from the hallway, shrill and ragged. He wasn't the composed power broker anymore. He was a rat in a maze that had suddenly caught fire. Thomas didn't move. He watched through the open door of the sanctuary as Sterling ran past, heading toward the parish office. A moment later, the sounds of destruction began. Drawers were being ripped out and thrown. Books were swept off shelves. It was the sound of a man tearing his life apart looking for a parachute. Gone! Sterling screamed, the word tearing out of his throat. It's gone. Who took it? Who took my money? He hadn't found the cash. Thomas hadn't taken it, which meant Sterling had either already spent it, or in his panic, he couldn't remember where he hid it. Or perhaps Vargas had already cleaned him out without him knowing. Sterling stumbled out of the office and into the sanctuary, a flashlight beam dancing wildly in his shaking hand. He looked deranged. His expensive trench coat was torn, his hair plastered to his skull, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He held the flashlight in one hand and the snub-nosed revolver in the other, waving both around as if fighting off invisible demons. Thomas! Sterling bellowed into the empty church. I know you're here. I saw the truck. Come out, you pious little parasite. Come out and tell me where the money is. The beam of the flashlight swept over the pews, over the confessionals, over the statues of the saints. It grazed the altar, but Thomas stayed low, pressed against the cold marble. You think you can rob me? Sterling screamed, walking down the center aisle, spinning in circles. I own this city. I own you. I bought the very roof over your head. Thomas took a breath. He reached down to his belt. He pressed the button. You don't own anything, Robert. Thomas's voice boomed through the sanctuary. The sound was immense. The ancient speakers, mounted high on the pillars, amplified his voice into the voice of God, deep, resonant, and coming from everywhere at once. Sterling spun around, dropping into a crouch, aiming the gun wildly at the ceiling. Show yourself. Where are you? I'm in the walls, Thomas said, his voice calm, distorted slightly by the feedback of the old system. I'm in the foundation. I'm in the rot you tried to paint over. It's over, Thomas, Sterling yelled, firing a shot blindly into the choir loft. The boom of the gun was deafening, followed instantly by the shattering of wood. Vargas is outside. The Russians are coming. Give me the codes to the account you transferred the money to, and I might let you live. There are no codes, Thomas replied, the speakers crackling. The money is gone, Robert. It's in a general aid fund for UNICEF. It's already being converted into rice and vaccines. You can't get it back. And neither can Volkov. Sterling let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He fell to his knees in the middle of the aisle, the flashlight rolling away across the stone floor, casting a long, spinning shadow. You killed me, he whispered. But the microphones picked up the acoustics of the room, carrying the whisper to Thomas. You stupid, ignorant priest. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from the Bratva. They'll skin us both alive. Confess, Thomas commanded. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Confess what? Sterling spat, standing up again, his anger overriding his fear. That I was smart? That I saw an opportunity? This church was dead 10 years ago. It was a corpse. I put it on life support. I brought the money in. You brought poison in. Thomas's voice thundered. You used the altar to run guns. You used the soup kitchen to wash blood money. Tell me, Robert, did you know? Did you know the crates were full of rifles? I didn't ask. Sterling screamed, pointing the gun at the altar now, sensing Thomas's location. That's how business works. You don't ask what's in the sausage, you just sell it. I made sure the heating bill was paid. I made sure the roof didn't collapse on the heads of those ungrateful wretches. You watered down their soup, Thomas said. You stole the skimming off the top. You betrayed everyone. The poor, the bishop, even your partners. I took my commission. Sterling roared, advancing toward the altar. I deserve it. I am the only reason this pathetic zip code hasn't been bulldozed. He fired again. The bullet chipped the marble corner of the altar, sending stone shrapnel flying. Thomas didn't flinch. He stayed low. And now, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly quiet. You have nothing. The accounts are zero. The police are listening. I patched the audio output into the emergency broadcast frequency. Robert, the dispatcher heard everything. The sirens you hear? They're for you. It was a bluff. Thomas hadn't figured out how to patch into the police frequency, only the internal PA, but Sterling didn't know that. Sterling froze. He cocked his head. In the distance, faintly, through the drumming of the rain, there was a sound. Sirens. No. Sterling Bimpered. No. He turned to run. He scrambled toward the side door, toward the rectory, toward escape. But the door opened before he could reach it. It wasn't the police. Vargas stepped into the sanctuary. He wasn't alone. 2 other men, dressed in dark tactical rain gear, flanked him. They held suppressed carbines with the casual familiarity of men who carried death as a trade tool. Sterling skidded to a halt, his shoes squeaking on the wet stone. He looked at Vargas, then back at the altar, then back at Vargas. Vargas. Thank God. He's here. The priest is behind the altar. He stole the money. Kill him. Vargas didn't look at the altar. He looked at Sterling. His face was a mask of indifference, water dripping from his shaved head. The money is gone, Robert, Vargas said. His voice didn't need a microphone to carry. It projected with the weight of a tombstone. We received the notification from the bank, and we received the email with your secondary ledger, the one where you take 5% from the shipping budget. Sterling dropped the gun, clattered loudly on the floor. He held up his hands, shaking violently. No, that was a clerical error. I was holding it in escrow. For Volkov. To protect it. Volkov does not need protection, Vargas said, raising his pistol. He needs examples. Wait, Sterling screamed. The priest. He knows everything. He's the leak. If you kill me, you lose the only person who knows how to fix the shell companies. The shell companies are burned, Vargas said calmly. The operation is closed. We are now in liquidation mode. He fired. It wasn't a dramatic shot. It was a double tap, efficient and dull, suppressed by the silencer to a sound like a heavy book falling flat. Sterling jerked backward, 2 dark holes appearing in the center of his chest. He looked surprised, his mouth opening to form a word that never came. He collapsed backward onto the stone floor, his eyes staring up at the vaulted ceiling, at the darkness where God was supposed to be. Thomas, behind the altar, flinched. He had wanted justice. He had wanted Sterling to face a judge. He hadn't wanted this. He squeezed the microphone in his hand, his breath catching. Vargas stepped over Sterling's body without looking down. He looked up, scanning the sanctuary. Come out, Father, he called out. I know you are there. I can hear you breathing on the speakers. Thomas realized his mistake. The mic was still live. Every gasp, every rustle of fabric was being broadcast. He fumbled to hit the mute button, but his hands were shaking. Do not bother, Vargas said. He signaled to the 2 men behind him. They spread out, moving down the side aisles, flanking the altar. There is no police coming. The sirens you heard were passing by on the highway. You are alone. Thomas looked around. He was trapped. The altar was a thick slab of marble, bulletproof, but he couldn't stay there forever. They would flank him in seconds. He had no weapon. He had a microphone and a flashlight he had dropped in the sacristy. He looked at the candles on the altar. The tall, beeswax candles used for High Massachusetts. They were lit. He grabbed one of the heavy brass candlesticks. It was 3 feet long, solid metal. It wasn't a gun, but it was a club. Father. Vargas's voice was closer now. Make this easy. Step out. We will make it quick. A heart attack. A tragic fall. Much better than what happens if my men have to chase you. Thomas closed his eyes. Forgive me, Father, for I am about to sin. He reached up and ripped the microphone off his collar. He didn't mute it. Instead, he grabbed the heavy candlestick and slammed it against the microphone head. Crack. The sound that exploded from the speakers was a sonic boom of feedback. A high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that amplified 1,000 times over. It was a physical blow. The speakers squealed in agony. Vargas and his men flinched, instinctively bringing their hands to their ears, wincing at the acoustic assault. In that split second of distraction, Thomas moved. He didn't run away. He ran at them. He vaulted over the altar, his black cassock flying like the wings of a crow. He swung the heavy brass candlestick with all the force of his desperation. The base of the candlestick connected with the helmet of the mercenary on the left flank. There was a sickening crunch of metal on composite, and the man went down, his rifle skittering across the floor. Thomas didn't stop. He rolled, grabbing the fallen rifle. He didn't know how to shoot a carbine, not really. He had fired shotguns at clay pigeons with his father, but this was a machine of war. He pointed it toward the center aisle where Vargas stood. Vargas had recovered faster than Thomas expected. He raised his pistol. Thwip, thwip. Bullets chipped the stone floor inches from Thomas's feet. Thomas pulled the trigger. The recoil surprised him, jamming the stock into his ribs. The gun sprayed a burst of fire, wild and uncontrolled. Bullets chewed up the pews, shattered the wooden hymn board, and blew out the glass of the votive candle rack, sending a shower of sparks and broken glass raining down. It wasn't accurate, but it was enough to force Vargas into cover behind a marble pillar. Suppressing fire, Vargas shouted. The third mercenary on the right opened up. Automatic fire raked the sanctuary. Thomas dove behind the communion rail, the wood splintering above his head. He crawled, scrambling on his hands and knees, dragging the stolen rifle. He headed for the side door, the one leading to the bell tower stairs. "He's heading for the tower," one of the men yelled. Thomas kicked the door open and threw himself inside, slamming the heavy oak bolt home just as a hail of bullets turned the doorframe into sawdust. He was in the narrow, spiral staircase of the bell tower. It was a dead end. He knew it. They knew it. But it was high ground. He began to climb. The stone steps were steep and worn by centuries of feet. His lungs burned. He could hear them pounding on the door below, then the sound of a shotgun hinge breacher boom, and the door giving way. "Go up! Flush him out!" Vargas's voice echoed up the shaft. Thomas reached the belfry. It was an open-air platform, housing the massive iron bell that hadn't rung in 20 years. The wind here was ferocious, howling through the arches, bringing the rain in horizontal sheets. He was 80 feet above the ground. Below him, the city was a grid of blurred lights. He moved to the edge, looking down. The G-Wagon and the mercenary's black SUV were parked below. He looked at the rifle in his hands. It was empty. He had fired the whole magazine in that one panic burst. He tossed it aside. He was trapped. He heard boots on the stairs. Slow, methodical. Thomas looked at the massive bell. It was suspended by a rusted iron yoke, connected to a thick rope that ran down the center of the shaft. He looked at the mechanism. It was seized with rust. "End of the line, father," Vargas said. Thomas turned. Vargas was standing at the top of the stairs, emerging onto the platform. He was alone. The stairs were too narrow for them to come up all at once. He held his pistol leveled at Thomas's chest. The rain ran down his face, washing away the sweat. "You fought well," Vargas said, raising his voice over the storm. "For a civilian, but mathematics always wins. You are one. We are three, and you have nowhere to go." Thomas backed up until his heels hit the low stone parapet. He could feel the drop behind him. "You killed Sterling," Thomas shouted. "He was your partner. He was a liability," Vargas said, stepping closer. "Just like you." "Hand over the drive, Thomas. Maybe I let you jump. It is cleaner." "I don't have the drive," Thomas said. "I gave it to a friend. If I die, the email goes to the FBI, the ATF, the press, everyone." Vargas paused. His eyes narrowed. "You are bluffing." "Am I?" Thomas smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. "I'm an auditor, Vargas. I always keep a backup." Vargas hesitated. In that hesitation, the balance of power shifted. Vargas couldn't kill him, not yet. Not until he knew for sure where the data was. "Grab him," Vargas shouted down the stairs to his men. "Do not shoot. We need him alive." The two mercenaries burst onto the platform, crowding the small space. They holstered their weapons and lunged for Thomas. Thomas didn't fight them. He stepped up onto the ledge of the parapet. "Don't do it!" Vargas yelled, lunging forward. Thomas looked at them. He looked at the bell. He looked at the rope that ran through the floor, down to the vestibule 80 feet below. He didn't jump off the building. He jumped in. He leaped toward the center of the belfry, grabbing onto the thick, rusted chain that held the clapper of the massive bell. His weight hit the chain. The rust groaned. The iron shrieked. The bell, silent for decades, swung. Yong! The sound was apocalyptic. Up here, right next to it, it was a physical concussion that rattled the teeth in their skulls. The massive bronze bell swung, and Thomas swung with it, holding on for dear life. As the bell swung back, his momentum carried him toward the open archway on the other side of the tower, the side facing the steep, slate roof of the nave. He let go. He flew through the air, flailing in the rain. He hit the slate roof hard. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He slid, clawing at the wet tiles. They were slick as ice. He slid down, toward the edge, toward a 40-foot drop to the concrete courtyard. His fingers scrambled for purchase. He caught the copper gutter. It groaned, bending under his weight, but it held. He hung there, dangling, gasping for air. Above him, in the belfry, Vargas and his men were looking down, cursing. They fired a few shots, but the angle was bad. The bullets sparked off the slate roof feet above Thomas's head. Thomas looked down. Below him was the dumpster, the one filled with the debris from the roof repairs. Drywall, insulation, with scraps. It was a 20-foot drop from the gutter. "God help me," he whispered. He let go. He fell through the darkness. He hit the dumpster with a bone-jarring crash, smashing through a sheet of plywood and landing in a pile of soggy pink insulation foam. Pain exploded in his ankle, shooting up his leg. He screamed, the sound muffled by the trash. He scrambled out of the dumpster, limping, falling, crawling. He was covered in filth, bleeding, his ankle possibly fractured. He dragged himself toward the stolen Ford truck parked in the shadows of the garage. He heard the mercenaries running down the tower stairs. They would be outside in seconds. Thomas threw himself into the cab of the truck. He turned the key. The engine sputtered. "Come on," he begged. "Come on." The engine roared to life. Thomas slammed it into gear. He didn't turn on the headlights. He floored it. The truck fishtailed in the mud, then found traction on the asphalt. He tore out of the alleyway just as Vargas burst out the side door, firing his pistol. The rear window of the truck shattered, showering Thomas with glass. He didn't look back. He drove blindly, one eye swollen shut from the impact, his leg throbbing with fire. He drove away from the church, away from the body of Robert Sterling, away from the ruins of his life. He hit the main road and turned his lights on. He grabbed the radio. It was just static. He needed to get back to Gary. He needed Sarah. And he needed a doctor. But as he passed a street lamp, he looked in the rearview mirror. Far behind him, a pair of headlights appeared. Then another. And then the blue and red lights of the police. But they weren't chasing him. They were swarming the church. Sterling was dead. The police were there. Thomas was a fugitive. A cop killer if they thought he shot Sterling. Or a witness. Either way, he was a dead man walking. He reached into his pocket. The USB drive was gone. He froze. He patted his pockets frantically. It must have fallen out. In the dumpster. On the roof. In the sanctuary. He had told Vargas he had a backup. He didn't. Sarah had the copy, yes. But the original? The one with the chain of custody? It was back there. And if Vargas found it? Thomas slammed his hand against the steering wheel. He screamed into the night, a raw, primal sound of frustration and rage. He kept driving. He had no choice. The audit wasn't over. It had just become a war of attrition. The drive back to Indiana was a blur of agony and asphalt. The stolen Ford F-150 shook violently as it hit 70 miles per hour, its alignment ruined by the jump off the curb. But Father Thomas Thorne kept his foot heavy on the accelerator. The adrenaline that had carried him off the church roof and through the dumpster was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, jagged landscape of pain. His left ankle was a swollen mass of fire throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Every vibration of the steering wheel sent a fresh shockwave up his leg, stealing the breath from his lungs. He drove with one eye shut, the other squinting through the spider-webbed windshield where a stray bullet had grazed the glass, turning the oncoming headlights of the highway into fractured, kaleidoscopic stars. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence of the cab was filled with the phantom echo of the gunshot that had ended Robert Sterling's life. Pop pop. Two sounds, flat and unremarkable, and a man was gone. A soul, however tarnished, had been extinguished in front of him. Thomas gripped the wheel tighter, his fingernails digging into the faux leather. He was a priest. He was supposed to be a shepherd, a protector of life. Instead, he had led a wolf to the slaughterhouse. The realization settled in his gut, heavier than the physical pain. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had rung the dinner bell. By the time he saw the flickering neon sign of the Bluebird Motel rising out of the Gary smog like a beacon of despair, his vision was tunneling. He pulled the truck around the back, parking it behind a rusted dumpster to hide the bullet holes and the shattered rear window. He killed the engine. For a moment he couldn't move. His body refused to unclench. He had to manually pry his fingers off the wheel. His hands cramped into claws. He opened the door and fell out more than he stepped out, hitting the wet pavement with a grunt that tore from his throat. He dragged himself toward room 12, leaving a trail of muddy water and blood mixed with the grime of the alley. Sarah opened the door before he could knock. She had been watching the window. Her face was pale, illuminated by the blue glow of her laptop screen, but her expression hardened instantly when she saw him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't gasp. She stepped forward, grabbed him by the front of his ruined cassock, and hauled him inside, kicking the door shut and locking the deadbolt in one fluid motion. "Chair," she commanded, guiding him to the flimsy laminate table. Thomas collapsed into the seat. The room spun. "Sterling is dead," he wheezed, the words tasting like copper. "Vargas. He executed him. Right on the altar." Sarah paused, her hand hovering over her backpack. She looked at Thomas, her dark eyes searching his face. "And you?" I rang the bell," Thomas whispered, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his chest. "I jumped." Sarah didn't ask for clarification. She knelt down and ripped the hem of his trousers open. The ankle was the size of a grapefruit, the skin stretched tight and turning a sickening shade of purple and black. There was a deep laceration on his calf where the slate roof had sliced him, bleeding sluggishly but persistently. "This is bad, Thomas," she said, her voice clinical. "That's a fracture. Maybe a tear. You need a hospital." "No hospital," Thomas gritted out, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. "Vargas will be watching the ERs. Sterling's body. The police are there now. I'm a suspect. I'm a cop killer in their eyes, or worse." Sarah cursed softly. She stood up and began dumping the contents of her bag onto the bed. "Okay, then we do this the hard way. I have a first aid kit, some superglue, and a bottle of vodka I bought from the vending machine. Bite down on something." She tossed him a rolled-up washcloth from the bathroom. Thomas shoved it between his teeth. The next 20 minutes were a blur of white-hot torture. Sarah wasn't a doctor, but she was thorough. She cleaned the cuts with the cheap vodka, the sting making Thomas's eyes water. She glued the laceration shut, pinching the skin together with a terrifying precision. Then came the ankle. She couldn't set a bone, but she could immobilize it. She used the cardboard from a pizza box and a roll of duct tape to fashion a crude splint, wrapping it tight enough to cut off circulation before easing back just a fraction. When she was done, Thomas spat the washcloth onto the table. He was sweating profusely, his hair matted to his forehead. He took a swig of the remaining vodka, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the throbbing in his leg. "You're going to limp for the rest of your life," Sarah said, wiping her hands on a towel. "But you can walk." "Barely." "Thank you," Thomas murmured. He looked at the laptop humming on the desk. "The drive. The USB. I lost it." The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah stopped moving. She turned slowly to face him. "You what?" I had it in my pocket, Thomas said, shame washing over him. When I jumped. The dumpster. It must have fallen out. It's gone, Sarah. It's buried in trash or sitting on the roof of the church. Sarah closed her eyes and exhaled a long, shaky breath. She walked to the window and peered through the blinds, checking the parking lot. We have the copy, she said, her voice low. I downloaded the files. It's not enough, Thomas said, shaking his head. I'm an auditor. I know how this works. Digital files without a chain of custody, without the hardware source. Any decent lawyer will claim we fabricated them. They'll say I hacked the church server and planted the data to frame Sterling. Without that physical drive, it's just ones and zeros. It's hearsay. It's enough to start an investigation, Sarah argued. An investigation that will take months, Thomas countered. Months during which the Bratva disappears. Months during which Vargas hunts us down. We needed the smoking gun to end it tonight. We needed the leverage. He slammed his hand on the table. I failed. I got Sterling killed and I lost the evidence. Stop it, Sarah snapped. She walked over and grabbed the laptop, spinning it around to face him. You didn't get Sterling killed. Sterling got Sterling killed. He played with sharks and got bit. Now focus. Look at this. Thomas blinked, trying to clear his vision. The screen showed a file directory, the one Sarah had decrypted from the download. It was a chaotic mess of spreadsheets and emails. I was digging while you were playing Spider-Man, Sarah said, pointing to a subfolder labeled rs_personal. Sterling was a narcissist, right? He kept records of everything. But he was also paranoid. Look at this file. Doomsday.
Doomsday.
Thomas squinted. It's a dead man's switch, Sarah explained. It was set to auto-email a specific address if he didn't log in every 48 hours. But since I cracked the password, I opened it manually. What's in it? Not a document, Sarah said. A coordinate. And a key code. She clicked the file. A map of Chicago popped up. A red pin dropped in the middle of a vast, gray industrial zone on the southwest side of the city. The Corwith Intermodal Facility. Thomas recognized it instantly. It was one of the largest rail yards in the country, a sprawling labyrinth of shipping containers and train tracks where cargo from all over the world was shuffled like a deck of iron cards. And this, Sarah pointed to a string of alphanumeric text. Unit 7734B. It looks like a container number, but it's not in the active manifest. It's off the books, Thomas realized. The auditor in him waking up, pushing through the pain. Sterling wasn't just skimming cash. He was keeping physical insurance. He knew Volkov might turn on him one day. He needed something Volkov couldn't delete. Physical ledgers? Sarah suggested. Or hard cash, Thomas said. Or the original shipping manifests that link the Bratva directly to the guns. Signatures, dates, proof that can't be hacked. If Sterling is dead, Sarah said, her voice dropping, then that container is sitting there, waiting. And Vargas knows it, Thomas said, a cold realization dawning on him. Sterling screamed it at the altar. He told Vargas, I have a secondary ledger. He was trying to bargain for his life. He told them he had insurance. So Vargas is heading there, Sarah finished the thought. If Vargas gets to that container first, he destroys the proof. The trail ends. The Bratva vanishes. And we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for a bullet. Thomas stood up. His bad leg buckled, and he grabbed the table for support, his face twisting in pain. But he didn't sit back down. We have to get there first, Thomas said. You can't walk, Thomas, Sarah protested. You need to rest. We can send the coordinates to the FBI anonymously. No time, Thomas said, limping toward the door. The FBI will need a warrant. They'll need to assemble a team. By the time they cut the lock, the container will be empty. We go now. Sarah looked at him. She saw the bruising on his face, the blood on his shirt, the tremor in his hands. But she also saw the fire in his eyes. It was the same look he had when he used to pull all-nighters finding a fraction of a cent in a billion-dollar audit. He wasn't running anymore. She grabbed her keys and the signal jammer. "The truck is burnt," she said. "We take the Civic." "And Thomas?" "Yeah. If we die in a rail yard in Chicago," she said, opening the door to the storm, "I'm going to be really pissed off at you in the afterlife." The drive back into Chicago was a descent into the belly of the beast. The storm had not abated. If anything, it had grown more vicious. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, shaking the small Honda Civic as Sarah navigated the treacherous slick of the Dan Ryan Expressway. The city skyline was a smear of gray and electric light, a fortress of steel and glass that seemed indifferent to the microscopic dramas playing out in its shadows. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, the laptop open on his lap. He was studying the layout of the Corwith yard. It was a mile long, a grid of tracks and stacked containers that formed canyons of steel. It was a needle in a haystack, but the needle was 20 feet long and weighed 2 tons. "Traffic is thinning out," Sarah said. Glancing at the GPS, "We're 10 minutes out. What's the plan? We drive up to the gate and ask for the murder locker?" "Security at Corwith is tight for the trucks, but the perimeter fence on the south side, near the old grain silos, is weak," Thomas said, reciting the details from a satellite view. "We go in on foot. We find Unit 7734B. We open it. We grab whatever is inside. And if Vargas is already there, then we improvise," Thomas said. He reached into the glove compartment. "Do you still keep that taser in here?" Sarah smirked grimly. "Under the seat, and there's a tire iron in the trunk." "Better than a candlestick," Thomas muttered. They exited the highway, entering the industrial district. The world here was different. No skyscrapers, no luxury condos. Just endless rows of warehouses, smokestacks belching steam into the rain, and the skeletal silhouettes of cranes looming like prehistoric beasts. The road surface was cracked and pitted, shaking Thomas's injured ankle with every bump. He gritted his teeth, turning the physical pain into a focusing lens. Sarah killed the headlights as they approached the perimeter of the rail yard. She pulled the car off the road, hiding it behind a derelict semi-trailer that had been left to rot in the weeds. "End of the line," she whispered. They got out. The noise of the yard was deafening even from here. The screech of metal on metal, the thud of containers being dropped, the roar of diesel locomotives shunting cars. It was a city within a city, mechanical and relentless. Thomas tested his weight on the splint. It held. The pain was a dull roar now, constant but manageable. He pulled his coat tighter. A spare mechanic's jacket Sarah had in the trunk, covering his torn clerical shirt. They moved toward the fence. As Thomas had predicted, a section near the drainage ditch had been cut and poorly patched with wire. Sarah used a pair of bolt cutters from her trunk to widen the gap. They slipped through, sliding down the muddy embankment and into the yard. They were in the canyons now. Walls of shipping containers, stacked 3 and 4 high, rose up on either side of them. The ground was loose gravel and oil-stained railroad ties. The rain poured down, turning the dust into black slurry. "GPS says it's in Sector 4, Sarah said, checking her phone which she shielded from the rain. "That's deep in, near the transfer cranes." They moved tactically, darting from shadow to shadow. Thomas took the lead, his limp pronounced but his pace urgent. He knew numbers, but he also knew logistics. He read the painted codes on the asphalt, navigating the grid. "Sector 2, Sector 3. Suddenly, a brilliant white light swept over the top of the container stacked to their right. A security patrol truck. They froze, pressing themselves against the cold, corrugated steel. The truck rumbled past, its tires crunching on the gravel. "Close," Sarah whispered. "Too close," Thomas agreed. "We need to move faster." They crossed a set of active tracks, the vibration of a distant train humming through the soles of their shoes. They reached Sector 4. It was older, a storage area for containers that were in legal limbo or waiting for long-term transport. The stacks here were higher, rustier. The shadows were deeper. "Unit 7734B, Thomas murmured, scanning the faded white numbers stenciled on the metal doors. "There," Sarah pointed. It sat at the bottom of a stack of 3, tucked away in a dead-end aisle formed by 2 towering walls of steel. It was a dark red container, scarred by salt and time. The number unit 7734 B was barely visible through the grime. Thomas limped toward it. A heavy padlock secured the latch. "The key code," Thomas said. "Doomsday." Sarah pulled up the file on her phone. "It's a combo lock?" "No, it's a heavy-duty puck lock. We can't type a code into that." Thomas looked at the lock closer. It wasn't digital. It was a standard high-security hasp. Sterling didn't leave a code for the lock. He left a code for the location of the key. "What?" "The alphanumeric string," Thomas said, his mind racing. 7734 B K19. K19. It's not part of the container number. It's a coordinate. He looked around. He looked at the chassis of the container. He looked at the surrounding area. K19, he muttered. "Keystone? Knight? Kickplate?" He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain. He felt under the frame of the container, along the rusty skirt. His fingers brushed against something cold and magnetic. A small hide-a-key box stuck to the underside of the steel beam. "Got you," he whispered. He pulled it off. Inside was a small brass key. He stood up, his hand shaking. He inserted the key into the padlock. Turned with a satisfying click. He pulled the heavy hasp free. He grabbed the locking bars of the container doors. "Ready?" he asked Sarah. She held the tire iron ready. "Open it." Thomas heaved. The hinges screamed in protest, a shriek of rusted metal that echoed through the yard. He pulled the door open. The interior was pitch black. Sarah clicked on her flashlight, aiming the beam inside. It wasn't empty. It was an office, a makeshift bunker-like office built inside the steel shell. There was a desk, a filing cabinet, and a wall of shelves. And on the shelves were binders. Dozens of them. Veritas, 2020. Veritas, 2021. Shipment logs, Class A. The motherlode, Sarah breathed. Physical ledgers. Original manifests. Thomas stepped inside, the air smelling of musty paper and dry rot. He opened a binder. It was all there. Signatures from Port Authority officials who had been bribed. Signatures from Sterling. And signatures from a man named N. Volkov. "This links the Bratva to everything," Thomas said. "Not just the money, the guns, the bribes. This brings down the whole network." "Grab what we can," Sarah said, pulling a duffel bag from her shoulder. "We fill the bag and we run." They began frantically shoving binders into the bag. Thomas grabbed a stack of hard drives sitting on the desk, likely the digital backups of the backups. Suddenly, the light in the container changed. The beam of Sarah's flashlight was washed out by a much brighter, harsher light flooding in from the open doors. Thomas spun around. Standing at the end of the aisle, silhouetted against the blinding headlights of an SUV that had silently rolled up, was a figure. It wasn't Vargas. It was Nikolai Volkov. The Russian stood under an umbrella held by a subordinate. He was wearing a pristine cashmere coat, unbothered by the industrial filth. Vargas stood beside him, his arm in a sling from where Thomas's bullet had grazed him earlier, his face a mask of pure hatred. Behind them were 4 more men, heavily armed. "I told you, Vargas," Volkov said, his voice smooth and amplified by the acoustics of the steel canyon. "The priest is diligent. He does the work for us." Thomas stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her. "It's over, Volkov," he shouted, his voice cracking but firm. "We have the files. The FBI knows we're here." "The FBI is sleeping," Volkov replied, taking a step forward. The rain drummed rhythmically on his umbrella. "And you, father, are trespassing. You have broken into my property." "This is Sterling's property," Thomas said. "Sterling worked for me. Therefore, his assets are my assets, including his insurance." Volkov gestured to the open container. "You have been very helpful, locating this for me." Sterling was difficult to interrogate in his final moments. He died before he could reveal the location of the key. You killed him for nothing, Thomas said. I killed him because he was incompetent, Volkov said coldly. And because he stole from me. However, you are simply a nuisance. A loose thread that refuses to be cut. Vargas stepped forward, drawing a fresh pistol with his good hand. Let me finish him, sir. Please. Volkov nodded slightly. Cleanly. We do not need a mess. Burn the container with them inside. Thomas looked at Sarah. She was clutching the tire iron, her eyes wide with terror. They were trapped. The only exit was the door, and it was blocked by a firing squad. Get back, Thomas whispered to her. Back where? She hissed. It's a metal box. Thomas looked at the desk. He looked at the heavy steel walls. He looked at the propane heater sitting in the corner of the makeshift office. A heater Sterling must have used during the winter months. It was connected to a 20-pound tank. Close the door, Thomas said. What? When I say now, you throw that door shut and lock it from the inside. Thomas, they'll burn us alive. Trust me, Thomas said. He grabbed the propane tank. He ripped the valve open. The hiss of gas filled the small space instantly. He grabbed the lighter Sarah had used for her cigarettes earlier. It was sitting on the desk. Hey! Thomas shouted at Volkov. You want your assets? Come and get them. He held up the lighter. Volkov stopped. He saw the tank. He saw the open valve. He's bluffing, Vargas growled. I'm a priest, Thomas yelled, his eyes wild. I believe in the afterlife. Do you? He flicked the lighter. The flame sparked. The gas hissed. Now, Thomas screamed. Sarah slammed the heavy steel door shut. Thomas dove for the floor, covering his head. But he didn't light the gas. He threw the lighter at the door just as it slammed. Outside, Vargas fired. The bullet hit the steel door with a deafening clang, but it didn't penetrate. They were sealed inside, in the pitch black, with the gas hissing. Turn it off, Sarah screamed, fumbling in the dark. Thomas reached out and cranked the valve shut. The hissing stopped. We're trapped, Sarah gasped. We're in a coffin. They're going to incinerate us. No, Thomas said, scrambling in the dark. He moved to the back wall of the container. Sterling was paranoid. Paranoid people always have a back door. He felt along the rear wall. The metal was cold. Help me move the filing cabinet, he ordered. Why? Because this container is a double, Thomas said, straining against the heavy metal cabinet. I saw the length from the outside. The office only takes up half the depth. There's a false wall. Sarah grabbed the other side. They heaved. The cabinet slid aside with a screech. Behind it was a panel. A cut in the steel welded with hinges. A hatch. Thomas kicked it open. It led to the other half of the container. And the other half wasn't empty. It was filled with crates. But more importantly, the rear doors of the container were visible at the far end. Go. Thomas shoved Sarah through the hatch. Outside, they heard Volkov's voice. Burn it. Seal the vents. They scrambled through the dark, over the crates of guns. They reached the rear doors, locked from the outside. Damn it! Thomas slammed his shoulder against them. Wait, Sarah said. She pointed her flashlight at the floor. Look, the floor of the container had a hatch. A maintenance access? No, it was a rust hole. A massive patch of corrosion that Sterling had covered with plywood. Thomas kicked the plywood aside. Below them, through the jagged hole in the floor, they could see the gravel and the railroad ties. Underground railroad, Thomas whispered. They squeezed through the hole, dropping onto the wet tracks beneath the container. They were hidden by the chassis, in the narrow crawlspace between the container floor and the ground. Above them, they heard the whoosh of an incendiary device being thrown against the front doors. The heat radiated through the steel instantly. Crawl, Thomas commanded. They crawled on their bellies through the mud and oil, moving underneath the stack of containers. Away from the fire, away from the headlights. They emerged on the other side of the stack, in the next aisle over. Smoke was billowing from the front of Unit 7734B. Volkov and his men were watching it burn. convinced their problems were turning to ash inside. Thomas stood up, wiping the mud from his eyes. He still had the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The binders were safe. "We have the proof," he whispered to Sarah. "And they think we're dead." "Let's keep it that way," Sarah said, shivering violently. They melted into the shadows of the rail yard, leaving the fire and Father Thomas's old life burning behind them in the rain. The rain finally stopped just as the dawn began to bleed into the sky over Lake Michigan. It was a bruised, purple light that filtered through the heavy cloud cover, illuminating the exhausted city of Chicago in shades of gray and steel. Inside the battered Honda Civic, parked in the shadow of the Tribune Tower on Michigan Avenue, the silence was absolute. Father Thomas Thorne sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against the cool glass, watching the few early morning pedestrians hurry by with their umbrellas folded. He looked like a man who had survived a war because he had. His face was a map of bruises, his left eye swollen shut, and his mechanic's jacket was stained with mud, oil, and dried blood. His ankle, wrapped in duct tape and cardboard, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic cadence that felt less like pain and more like a reminder that he was still alive. Beside him, Sarah Chun was asleep, her head pillowed on the steering wheel, her breathing soft and ragged. The duffel bag sat between them on the center console, heavy with the weight of sins that weren't theirs. It contained the physical ledgers, the shipping manifests, and the hard drive stolen from the belly of the beast. It was the smoking gun, the bullet, and the verdict all wrapped in muddy nylon. Thomas reached out and gently touched Sarah's shoulder. She jerked awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron in the door pocket before her eyes focused. She blinked, looking at the tower looming above them, then at Thomas. "It's time," Thomas said, his voice raspy. Sarah rubbed her face, smearing a streak of grease across her cheek. "You sure about this? Once we walk in there, there's no going back. You're not just burning Sterling. You're burning the diocese. You're burning your own life." "My life burned down in a shipping container 3 hours ago," Thomas said, opening the car door. He grabbed the duffel bag, wincing as the movement pulled at his injuries. "What's left is just the cleanup. They didn't go to the police." The Chicago PD was a sprawling organism, and Thomas knew that corruption often lived in the capillaries of such beasts. If they walked into a precinct, the evidence might disappear into an evidence locker, only to be misplaced before a trial. No, Thomas was an auditor. He knew that the only way to ensure transparency was to make the data public, to make it impossible to ignore. They walked into the lobby of the Chicago Tribune. The security guard looked up, ready to turn away the two homeless-looking figures approaching his desk, but stopped when he saw the look in Thomas's eyes. It was a look of terrifying clarity. "We need to see the editor of the city desk," Thomas said, placing the duffel bag on the polished marble counter with a heavy thud. "And you might want to call the FBI. Tell them to bring a truck." The next 48 hours were a blur of caffeine, harsh fluorescent lights, and the frantic clicking of keyboards. The story broke on Sunday morning, landing on doorsteps with the weight of a physical blow. The headline was simple, printed in bold, black block letters above the fold: "The Altar of Greed." Below it was a photograph, not of Sterling or Volkov, but of the water-damaged ceiling of St. Jude's, juxtaposed with a scanned image of a wire transfer for $2 million sent to the Cayman Islands. The city woke up to shock, but by noon, the shock had turned to action. Thomas watched it all from a safe house provided by the FBI, a nondescript hotel room near O'Hare Airport. He sat in a chair by the window, his leg elevated, watching the news coverage on the mute television. The montage of justice was cinematic in its swiftness. At 10 a.m., a convoy of black tactical vehicles descended on the Corwith Intermodal Facility. Aerial footage from a news helicopter showed agents swarming Sector 4. They found the burnt husk of Unit 7734B. They found the false wall. And beneath it, they found the tunnel. The visuals were damning. Federal agents hauling crates of assault rifles out of the mud. The St. Jude's logo visible on some of the shipping labels. At 11:30 a.m., the camera cut to the scene at the Onyx Club. Nikolai Volkov was led out in handcuffs. He didn't cover his face. He didn't struggle. He walked with the eerie calm of a man who viewed prison as merely a change of office location. He looked directly into the news camera, his pale blue eyes cold and unrepentant, before being guided into the back of a federal SUV. He was charged with racketeering, arms trafficking, and money laundering. The Sunday edition had published his signature from the manifests found in the duffel bag, a signature that linked him directly to the crates. His high-priced lawyers could argue against digital files, but they couldn't argue against ink and paper. At 1 p.m., the police tape went up around St. Jude's Parish. The body of Robert Sterling was removed in a black body bag, wheeled out past a crowd of stunned parishioners who stood in the rain, clutching rosaries and weeping. They weren't weeping for Sterling. They were weeping for the betrayal. They were weeping for the loss of their sanctuary. Thomas turned the TV off. The silence in the hotel room was heavy. Sarah was sitting on the other bed, reading a book, her laptop finally closed. "You did it," she said softly. "You got them all." "I didn't save the church," Thomas replied, looking at his hands. They were clean now, scrubbed of the oil and blood, but they felt empty. St. Jude's is a crime scene. It will be seized, boarded up. The people, Maria, they have nowhere to go. "They have the truth," Sarah said. "And they have the money. The UNICEF transfer went through. It's untouchable. Sterling's stolen millions are already buying rice in Sudan and penicillin in Yemen. You balanced the books, Thomas. You just had to burn the ledger to do it." Thomas nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, plastic clerical tab, the white collar he had removed in the alleyway. He turned it over in his fingers. It was a piece of plastic worth maybe 50 cents. But it represented a life he had committed to, a vow he had taken. "Are you going back?" Sarah asked. "The diocese. They might reinstate you. Eventually. You're a hero, technically." "I'm not a hero," Thomas said. "And I'm not a priest. Not anymore." He tossed the tab into the trash can. It landed with a soft click. "I'm an auditor," he whispered. "And my shift is over." Winter came early to Chicago that year. By November, the city was encased in iron-gray ice, the wind howling off the lake with a ferocity that drove everyone indoors. The snow covered the grime of the streets, turning the potholes and the garbage into soft, white mounds, hiding the scars of the city under a blanket of purity. Thomas Thorne walked down 43rd Street, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He walked with a cane now, a sleek, black hickory stick that he leaned on heavily with every step of his left leg. The ankle had healed, but the limp was permanent, a structural defect in his own architecture that would never be fully repaired. He wasn't wearing black. He wore a gray wool coat, a thick scarf, and sturdy boots. He looked like any other man walking through the South Side, worn down, tired, but moving forward. He stopped in front of the chain-link fence that surrounded St. Jude's. The church was a husk. The windows were boarded up with plywood. The doors were padlocked with heavy chains. A sign posted by the city declared the building condemned. The roof, finally, had given way in the first heavy snow, collapsing the nave into a pile of rubble and memories. The gargoyles still perched on the bell tower, looking down at the ruin with indifferent stone eyes. It should have been a sad sight, a failure. But as Thomas looked at it, he didn't feel sadness. He felt a strange, quiet peace. The rot was gone. The lie was over. The building had died so that the cancer inside it could be cut out. "It looks smaller than I remember," a voice said beside him. Thomas turned. Standing there, bundled in a thick parka and holding a shopping bag, was Maria. She looked older, the lines in her face deeper, but her eyes were bright. She wasn't the terrified woman watering down soup anymore. "Maria," Thomas smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "It's good to see you. And you, Father. I mean, Thomas," she corrected herself, a shy smile appearing. "We heard you were in the city. People talk. People always talk," Thomas said. "How are you? How is everyone?" "We are surviving," Maria said. She gestured down the street. The Baptist church on 45th, They opened their basement to us. The smaller, but the roof is dry. And the soup. She paused, her eyes tearing up slightly. The soup is thick. Real chicken. Vegetables. We have enough. I'm glad, Thomas said, his throat tight. You know, Maria said, shifting her bag, when the police came, when they told us what Mr. Sterling did, what you did to stop him, some people were angry. They said you destroyed our home. Thomas looked down at his boots. I know. But, Maria continued, stepping closer and placing a gloved hand on his arm. Then we saw the news. We saw the guns. We realized that St. Jude's hadn't been a home for a long time. It was a cage. You let us out. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped package. I made empanadas. I was taking them to the shelter. Take one. Thomas took the warm package. The heat seeped through his gloves, thawing his frozen fingers. Thank you, Maria. Are you coming to the service on Sunday? She asked. The Baptist pastor. He says you are welcome. He says he needs someone to help with the books. Thomas laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that surprised him. Tell him I'm retired from accounting. My rates are too high. Maria squeezed his arm one last time. Vaya con Dios, Thomas. And with you, Maria. She walked away, her footsteps crunching in the snow, heading toward the warmth of the new shelter. Thomas watched her go until she turned the corner. He turned back to the church. He looked up at the bell tower, at the empty archway where he had swung out into the void. He thought about the man he was before he came here, the arrogant corporate auditor who thought money was the only truth. He thought about the man he tried to be, the priest who thought prayer could fix a leaking roof. And he realized he was neither of those men anymore. He was the synthesis. He was the man who knew that faith and facts were not opposites, but partners. Faith was believing the building could stand. Facts were checking the foundation to make sure it didn't kill anyone. He adjusted his grip on the cane. The wind picked up, swirling snow around him. A black car slowed down as it passed him. Thomas tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where he used to carry a phone, or a drive, or a weapon. But the car didn't stop. It was just a family driving home. The fear, the shadow of Vargas of the Bratva was fading. The network was broken. Volkov was in a federal supermax. The threat was gone. Thomas took a bite of the empanada. It was delicious, rich, spicy, and real. Tasted like life. He turned away from the ruins of St. Jude's. He didn't look back. He began to walk down the snowy street, his limp creating a distinct, uneven rhythm in the silence. Step, click, step, click. He didn't know where he was going next. He didn't have a parish. He didn't have a firm. He didn't have a title. But as he walked under the flickering streetlights, Thomas Thorne realized something profound. For the first time in his life, his ledger was balanced. The debts were paid. The credit column was full. He breathed in the cold, clean air of the winter night. Amen, he whispered to the empty street. And then he walked on, disappearing into the white, silent city, a man finally at peace with his own shadow.